All right, happy Wednesday. This is the Weekend Debrief. I'm Josh Durso, the news director here at FingerLakes1.com. And as per usual, I'm joined in studio by Ted Baker. He's the host of Finger Lakes Morning News over on Finger Lakes News Radio. Ted, welcome back. Do we have transmission switchage? Has it been completed?
Yes, we have. We're on 106.3 FM. Actually, the previous 95.9 is still running alongside for a little while longer.
Okay.
But not very long. So 106.3, the coverage, the total coverage is about the same. It's not exactly the same geographically, so apologies if your area was one that got 95.9 better than 106.3. I think its coverage is a little better to the west towards Canandaigua, whereas 95.9 was better to the east towards Seneca County.
Good news for me as I commute from Rochester each and every day, or most days of the week. Before we get into our big run, or I should say the topics that everybody expects us to be getting to, which is coronavirus, I wanted to touch on a few things that either are or have not yet been stories on FingerLakes1.com. First up, last night, the Seneca County Board of Supervisors met, and it was really quite a tense exchange that broke down between IDA Executive Director Sarah Davis and a few members of the Board of Supervisors. At issue, once again, like what you and I talked about a few weeks ago, Ted, was the sale of the Hillside campus. The big news, I think, that came out of that was the realization that migrant housing is either in the works or happening actively in one of the buildings that was referred to by the IDA as dilapidated just a few months ago while they were going through the process of trying to sell it. Now, for background, the property was assessed, the raw assessment was in the millions. The valuation of the property was in the mid $320,000 to $350,000 range, I believe. But it actually was sold to Earl Martin, who owns another large portion of the depot property, for $65,000. So you have that part of the issue where a lot of folks are frankly just unhappy with the price, the process, how it was advertised, how few people actually came forward, developers that is, to do anything with it because it was sold during the early days of the coronavirus pandemic. That being said, the debate last night really seemed to be hinging on what the IDA said before and what they are saying now. So before, it was a matter of, and I actually think you guys interviewed a member of the IDA fairly recently, or maybe it was Lucas who did, where the argument was effectively made, we just wanted to get rid of the property. Like, what are we supposed to do with this? But now it appears as though the IDA may have known, or there may have been some indications, meeting minutes from a planning board meeting in Romulus in the month of August show that there was desire to put migrant housing. A company wanted to do migrant housing in Romulus or Varick or in that area, and they were directed to the Hillside property. They were told to go that direction. So it calls into question, and we talk about this all the time. Effective communication, and also the way in which an agency that struggles with transparency, whether it's perceived transparency issues or real transparency issues, is always going to keep cropping up if there's so much uncertainty connected to something like this, a sale of a property. So I'm curious, obviously this hasn't been heavily reported yet, but I'm curious, as you hear the latest turn in this, surprised, unsurprised, or should this be what we expected to see? And is the IDA actually maybe not in the wrong? They sold the property, they're done with it, and move on.
Well, I guess I'm not really terribly surprised. One of the things that I find fascinating about all this is this description of this property as dilapidated. It's not that long since Hillside was in there housing kids in these buildings. So were they in substandard shape then, or did this now just happen? I struggle to understand that part. And I just wonder if government agencies have the expertise to be in the real estate business. It sounds like the IDA wanted to get rid of the property. Someone came along and they said, "Phew, this is off our hands now." Would it have hurt them to hold on to it longer? We talked about this, I think, the last time, is how widely did they market it? Is there a chance that there's some developer out there halfway across the country for whom this property would have been perfect and they would have paid the assessed price at least, if not more, but they didn't know about it? I don't know the answer to those things.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think, because there's this, I think there's a functional description of what IDAs are instructed by the state to do, and then there's the expectation among residents, taxpayers, a lot of times elected officials, of what they want them to do. And I think the strained relationship between the Board of Supervisors and the IDA is probably partly to blame in this specific circumstance. But anytime there's disconnect between the two, or there's a perception that the IDA isn't doing its due diligence, and I'm saying this is in any county. We've seen it play out in Ontario County. We've seen it play out in other places too. The IDA is always going to be at fault. You know what I mean? Like, in terms of the court of public opinion, the IDA is always going to be at fault because what are they doing? Most of the time, they're giving out tax breaks in some way, shape, or form. Until we change the system, and this is the question that kept bouncing back to me, especially on Twitter as I was tweeting about it last night, was, well, what could have been done differently? And the answer is, until IDAs systematically change, the way IDAs function systematically change, you're always going to have these types of issues cropping up. Should the IDA have known or done a better job of figuring out before they accepted Earl Martin's offer what he was going to do? And furthermore, another question, I think, big picture, that every single IDA or development corporation has to wrestle with moving forward is, what happens when a developer changes up the plans after the deal is done? Should there be some sort of timeline on how long they have to either follow through on delivering the number of jobs that they're going to say they deliver, or also delivering on the actual X's and O's of what they say they're going to deliver? If you're going to build 410 steel boxes, then you better produce 410 steel boxes and not, 3 months after the deal is the ink's dry, change it up to, well, we're going to produce 405 tents instead of steel boxes, because you're going to have this perception in some pockets of the community, at least, that the IDA knew all along.
I think that would be a good start, would be to say, okay, let's make this more solid contractually or legally, however it's done, and have more follow-up, because that's been one of my complaints for years, is these big splashy announcements, and we run them and you run them, and then 5 years go by, and who remembers to go back and say, oh yeah, there's not 410 boxes, there's 112, or yeah. And obviously economic conditions change, so I don't know how much you can lock these things into stone. How widely did the IDA market this property? It's entirely possible that no one else other than Earl Martin was going to be interested, and they made the best deal that they could, and that there's really no reason to blame them for anything. But we just really don't know.
Yeah, and I think in this specific circumstance, you've also got, I could tell just from the reaction and, let me rephrase that. I could tell from the reaction in the room, as well as the reaction in sort of the real-time feedback as people were watching this meeting, when the words migrant housing came up, that raised some brows. And, good, bad, and different. I think that, this is a due diligence problem. And at the end of the day, every IDA is going to have to battle with this one. I'm not really sure what the answer is, but that's something I wanted to just sort of talk about off the top here. Next little item that hasn't yet been published, but is something that I think is interesting to talk about, because we're both in the news business, and there were no criminal charges in the fatal crash involving a motorist and a bicyclist in Clyde. Happened over the summer. A teen was on his bicycle early in the morning. It was dark. Driver didn't see. Unfortunately, the teen passed. And anytime we have a story like this, there is typically some response where folks will say, well, why did you publish the person's name who was not criminally charged or found to be, I don't want to say found to be innocent because that's clearly not the implication of not being charged. But it's interesting to me because my philosophy has always been it's part of the public record. Like, if I'm involved in an accident, good, bad, or indifferent, you're involved, like I was involved in that accident that prompted a response from taxpayer-funded agencies and officials. It feels to me like if you start squelching pieces of information from various, because at the end of the day, what was this based on? You know, these stories were based on, and we were definitely not the only ones who ran this particular story with the names published. The Times did, I believe you guys did, folks did. It's part of what police and law enforcement and, in this case, prosecutors said and released. And that is not information that I think we should be holding back on, especially in this moment. I think if there's a narrative that police are trying to put out there, or if there are statements that they are trying to put out there, I think that if you want to be critical of those actions or critical of those narratives or statements or whatever the case may be, they've got to get out there first. You've got to be able to see them.
I think in general that we should be in favor of openness. I think we're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, because if you withhold this information, let's say it turns out to be a prominent person, and then we get criticized, well, why are you covering up for this guy, or what are you trying to hide? So I don't really have any problem with it, and we have the presumption of innocence. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't really follow that. They see a name, and they see that 32-year-old so-and-so was accused, and they equate that with guilt. But I don't think, as information disseminators, that really is or should be our problem.
Yeah. And another story that's definitely connected, the throughway crash where a family was pretty well devastated by it. A Geneva driver driving a pickup truck slammed into the back of the minivan. 2 young kids died in that accident. Early September, I want to say it was in the first week. We saw a couple quick releases come from state police within a week or so, and then everything went dark. We had reached out, so our newsroom and I had reached out at the end of September, at the end of October, and then at the end of November. And it was interesting because there were no criminal charges filed. State police said that they worked with the local DA's office to get to that conclusion or get to that space. The DA had contended here in Seneca County in late October that the DA's office was just waiting for state police to finish their investigation. There wasn't really any indication that no charges was going to be the outcome. Now, the interesting part, I think, and we haven't heard a ton about what the investigation actually looked like, but here's the thing that strikes me as odd. The final press release in September that was released by state police said that charges were pending. That was what it said. Take that as you may. Fast forward 2.5 months, and you haven't heard anything, and then the first thing we hear is no charges filed, and that previous press release was wiped from the internet. It disappeared. This could be completely on the up and up, or it could not be on the up and up. No one will know. But what is known, and we published a screenshot of the press release when we updated the story because, frankly, I felt like it was part of the story at that point. You had this investigation, which even fatal car crash investigations typically do not last months. Maybe sometimes a week or two, but never months, usually. So it was just interesting, I think, that after all of that was said and done, you had the previous press release just disappear. Strange.
Yeah, I again, in the interest of transparency, why not just explain? If there's a reasonable explanation, wouldn't most people accept it? If you say, well, we looked into it and we thought X, Y, and Z had happened, but it turns out X and Z didn't really happen, therefore we feel there was no need for a criminal charge. It's just, just give the information. Very often what we deal with in the media is we deal with people who give us the information they want us to have and withhold everything else. And that's where you have to dig, and then we're seen as being antagonists instead of just trying to get to the truth. So, okay, if there were no charges, why? Simple release. Go into whatever little or great detail you feel is appropriate. If there's some sort of privileged information or something that doesn't really need to come out because it doesn't serve the public interest, fine. But to just say, yeah, we're going to charge somebody in a couple of days, and then, nope, we're not charging anybody, and you don't get to know why, doesn't really work for me.
Yeah, it's that's one of the head scratchers, and unfortunately, at the end of the day, it breeds the kind of mistrust that we wind up talking about a lot on this podcast with law enforcement in general. Let's talk about some non-law enforcement stuff before we get into our COVID headlines. There was a really interesting piece by Bill Fulton on from Rice University. He's the former mayor of Ventura, California, on Medium that actually led to us doing a podcast with him, talking about urban renewal in communities like Auburn, Geneva, Canandaigua. He's from Auburn. He grew up in Auburn. That's where he started. He was actually a reporter for The Citizen way back in the day. Really interesting guy, really interesting conversation. Anybody listening should go back and check that out. And also read his piece. It's a tank. I think it's like 3,000 words long, but it's definitely worth reading because it's interesting to me that given the context of the pandemic, a lot of these communities are going to be in a very interesting place when they get on the other side of this, because the meat of his piece is really hinging on this idea that communities like Auburn were starting to make up ground from the losses during the urban renewal period in the 60s and 70s, when you sort of had the birth of arterials and things like that, bypass, get around downtown and into suburbia. And it's interesting because all of the ground that's been made up is built on restaurants, breweries, small businesses that aren't your typical sort of, a bunch of lawyers in a building, or your non-traditional, it's in effect tourism and service. And it's fascinating because all of the progress that's been made, say, in the last 2 decades could very easily be lost on the other side of this thing. But you started to read his piece. You say you got through like half of it. As you were reading that, what was standing out to you?
Well, one thing was the parallels to where I grew up. I was born in and grew up in a neighboring community in a paper mill town in northern New Hampshire, and much like a downtown Auburn, it thrived. And these are one of the factors that I was going to get into, is it thrived until in the mid-1970s, the founding family that had always owned the paper company sold it to a publicly traded company. Now, job one becomes return to shareholders. The owners didn't live in the community with the workers anymore. The owners didn't care about the community. They cared about maximizing return. If that means offshoring jobs to Malaysia, then that's what they did. So there's that, and then I've thought about this a lot because I'm fascinated by just the way life has developed in America over the 20th century. I think what we had back in the 50s is first thing was we had the pent-up consumer demand at the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. Everybody sacrificed through World War II. Then the soldiers came back, 2 cars in every garage, chicken in every pot. So there was this demand for more, and then the automobile got better, more reliable, and more comfortable. And now it became practical to drive 25 miles away to eat dinner or to buy things when it really never was. I mean, even when I was younger, get into a car on a winter day and it was miserable. If you were lucky, the heat would warm up by the time you got where you were going. Now we get in, we push a few buttons on the touch screen, and 5 minutes down the road, it's 72 degrees in our car and we're pulling our jacket off. So I think the car is another factor. And then I think at about that time, advertising began to equate products with manliness and sexiness and lifestyle, rather than you go back, you look at ads from the 1920s, and the ad was, this is what this product does. It's good, it's sturdy. And then we went into the, Joe Namath with the shaving cream and the hot girls around him. So I think kind of all those factors came together to really change life right around the 1950s or so. And that was the thinking of the time, is build bypasses and go, 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 America on the move. And then we looked back 20 or 30 years later and said, wait a minute, is this really what we wanted?
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about economic restrictions and things like that here in a little bit. But I think in general, we're still going to be seeing the trend, I think, toward more walkable communities, more everything is here kind of communities. And I think it's probably even going to be happening in a lot of the suburbs. One of the interesting things that, as I read some other pieces by Bill, that he's published on sort of he is an urban planner by trade. So this is what he does. And one of the interesting things that he briefly mentioned in the podcast, but he's written about at length a couple other times, is what we're seeing in even a lot of suburbs is this sort of drive toward completeness again. This drive toward putting as much of the essentials, or as many of the essentials as you can, into these suburbs, where it was for the 90s and early 2000s, it was the opposite. It was, put your very sort of dry, bland corporate things in the suburbs and put your interesting things that people are going to go to in the city. The interesting things are coming out again, and that trend is probably going to continue. But when you talk about the pandemic, obviously, a lot of the things that have been around, or a lot of the businesses that have made a mark or started this revolution, we'll call it, over the last 20, 30 years, it likely could be gone after the pandemic's over.
I think one of the things that's going to happen after this pandemic is I think a lot of us are going to begin to question the consumer society and life built around work and working and working and working to buy things that are outdated next year and pay $1,000 for a phone only to buy another one 2 years from now that's 1 millimeter thinner and has some new gadget on the screen. I really think, and it's going to create a challenge, because I think we're going to see a general contraction of the economy. I think as people live what looks like now is going to be a year or more, maybe a year and a half, without a lot of things, and in many cases with less income, I think they're going to start to say, hey, we got through this okay. I don't really need the latest consumer gadget. I don't need to stand in line to buy the Xbox 5 or whatever it is, PlayStation 5, that's 2% better than the PlayStation 4. I think there's going to be a real reimagining, to use the hot term these days, of the way we live and what we live for.
Yeah, I would agree to a certain extent. I think that the things that become, I don't want to go that far. I think maybe the things that people spend more money on will shift a little bit. So I think on the other side of this, travel and experience are probably going to be bigger spending items than, say, the latest gadget. Partly because, and this is criticism of personal technology in general. As someone who literally works in and is surrounded by technology constantly, we haven't seen a big leap in smartphones for about 6 years or so. We haven't seen a big leap in personal computing technology really in the last decade. Laptops are about as good as they were a decade ago. If you had the resources to get the best processors, the best this, that, the other thing. Has the cost of entry decreased a bit in those categories? In some, yes. In others, not so much. But I think a lot of people are going to be much more focused on if they can find a house or an apartment that's centrally located in a community where they can work from home. I think the things that can be tailored to experience, meaning the new restaurants, the new bars, the new quirky businesses that pop up in downtown spaces that people can walk to, I think is going to be a big a big shift. And then also on the travel side, and this was one of the things that Bill mentioned in our conversation, was how planners are probably going to have to focus more on, I forget the exact phrasing he used, but effectively single parking events or single parking community. What do I mean by that? So like if you're visiting Rochester, you're able to park in one spot and walk to everything else that you do as an outsider to that community without having to go in, park, drive, go in, sort of over and over and over again, which is classic suburbia in terms of what you have to do. You go to the strip mall, most people don't even, the strip malls are so physically large that people don't even like, walking from one end to the next, especially if the weather is poor. So, I think there's going to be more focus on creating single parking experiences rather than, and experiences in general in terms of travel. I don't think, as an example, listening to the folks in tourism talk about what's happening now in tourism, local tourism, Finger Lakes tourism, because of the pandemic where you have a lot of regional travelers, I think that's going to continue afterward. I don't think that's going to change because I think a lot of people are figuring out now that, I can do a dozen day or 2 day trips with my family instead of 1 or 2 large vacations per year. And which are you getting more value out of? Which are you getting more bang for your buck out of? And I think that's probably always a pendulum swinging back and forth. Yeah. But right now, at least probably for the next 5 to 10 years, we're on the short side of that, for sure.
I think also, to even go one further than your single parking idea, I think is a no parking idea. I think more and more young people are looking at the cost of obtaining and maintaining a car, and they're saying, why do I need this? If I live in an apartment in a nice downtown, say downtown Geneva, you can walk to good restaurants. You can walk to the Smith Opera House and see a show. You can walk to craft breweries and cideries. And that's the other thing I think that symbolizes all this is the return of craft. Yeah. People are, I think, less interested in the mass market chain store product and more in something that's crafted. I mean, we've seen that, as most people know, I'm a big craft beer aficionado. In the late 1800s, breweries were largely small and local. Then came your Schlitz and Budweiser and Miller and Coors and everybody else, and it became big and corporate, and now we're seeing it go back the other way. So we just, New York State just barely in the last couple of years equaled the number of breweries it had back in, I think, the 1860s or 70s. So it's a bit of a pendulum shift, I think, driven by young people. I mean, that's who Madison Avenue likes to reach. So it's your age and even younger are going to be the ones, I think, driving these new trends in development and transportation and entertainment and the way we live and work and shop.
Okay, so let's get into the COVID headlines. Obviously, a lot of changes, it looks like, are coming at least in the next 5 to 6 days. First up, Governor Cuomo is expected to make an announcement on new restrictions on businesses like restaurants and bars. The question that I actually threw to you when I built this script yesterday was, could the entire region be turned into one large orange or red zone? And after listening to the Seneca County Board of Supervisors meeting last night and hearing what Chairman Hyson and County Manager Mitch Rowe heard on the daily regional control room call, it sounds like that actually may be what ends up happening, where the entire large swaths of the state are going to go into orange or red classification. It's interesting to me because I am not totally sure how because listening to what the governor said in the beginning of the week, which was that if the hospitalization trend, the rate, did not level off by the end of the week, we were going to see upstate indoor dining go from 50% to 25%. That does not jive with a complete and total orange and or red zone unless there's a real recalibrating happening in Albany right now on what the next phase of this response to the pandemic is going to be like.
Well, and here's the thing about this week's announcement is we keep getting this guidance, in quotes, that leaves us with more questions and fewer answers than we had before. Why the sudden pivot to hospitalization rates? All year long, it's been positive test percentage. That's what we get you get the same email we get every day with the governor's update. Now suddenly we pivot to hospitalization rate. And I'm not even sure, here we are in the news business, I'm not even sure what the triggering threshold is. It was something about 90% of something. I'm not even sure what it is. So nobody knows what the guidance is. And then secondly, the only thing he mentioned in the entire thing was restaurants.
Right.
And then you probably saw this, Channel 10, Jennifer Lukey said, well, wait a minute, what about all these gyms and salons and everything? Now it turns out that they apparently were never spreaders of any significance to begin with, but you're never going to hear Andrew Cuomo say, I was wrong. It's like the Fonz, if you ever remember that Happy Days episode where he tried to say he was wrong and he couldn't get the word out of his mouth. So I don't know where this came from. Here's this new, we had phase 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we had colors. Now we have hospitalization rates. And I just don't understand what changed.
I think in fairness, this is probably a better approach. Using hospitalization rate is probably a better marker for restricting economic activity than just general positivity rate, right? Because it varies by how many tests are actually being done. And in a lot of communities, I'm now actively hearing officials in public health, officials at the county level, officials in schools even saying we need to do more testing to drive our numbers down. And that is in my view, that's a complete manipulation of what the virus, manipulating what the virus is really doing in the community.
It is. And here's the other question. We talked about this extensively this morning. When the governor and the state say Finger Lakes, they really mean Rochester, Monroe County. Mm-hmm. The population of Monroe County, I looked it up, is 770,000. The population of the areas that we serve and you serve, Ontario, Seneca, Cayuga, Yates, Wayne, roughly 250,000.
Yep.
So about 3/4 of this Finger Lakes population is in Greater Rochester. If you look at the Ontario County dashboard, I didn't today, but I did yesterday, it said there were 12 people hospitalized in Ontario County because of COVID.
Right.
We have 3 hospitals in Ontario County. We have Thompson, we have Geneva General, we have Clifton Springs. 12 divided by 3 doesn't sound anything like overwhelmed to me.
So 2 things on that, because this is one of the things that cropped up last week, and it actually prompted me to do the one thing that I've only done twice this whole year, which is post to Facebook. Why people are hospitalized is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Like the counties, and here's where this is why I think focusing more on hospitalization rate is just a better process, because we already know that we don't have a lot of hospital beds around here. And while there's only 3 hospitals there are 3 hospitals in Ontario County, they aren't just serving Ontario County. They're also serving Seneca County and serving Yates County, because Yates County only has 1 very small hospital. And part of it, I think, is when people start to focus on the why individuals are hospitalized in relation to this whole idea that if your hospital gets full, it doesn't matter why it's full. It just matters that it's full. And whether you have maybe it's a 70-30 split. Maybe only 30% of the people who are hospitalized because of COVID. But you're assuming at the same time, because a lot of what we've been hearing in terms of national reporting is that the bar to get hospitalized across the board, whether you're having, maybe some sort of heart issue or you're having some sort of other life-threatening issue or COVID, is raising. It's getting higher because they need to keep as many beds free as they can for the people who may come in because of COVID. I think there's a bit of an illusion among most people about how robust our hospital system is or is not. To be clear, it is not. Our hospital system in the Finger Lakes is not robust, period. And if you have a scenario where you are all of a sudden, and I think this is where it gets back to the governor's plan, which is if within 3 weeks you are on pace to get to 90% hospital capacity, that's when restrictions will be imposed. I think, to me, that makes a hell of a lot more sense than just haphazardly basing it on how many positive tests there are, which testing, even in the best case scenario, has been super inconsistent. Positives, negatives, this, that, the other thing. At least this is something real, right? Like, these are real people who are in the hospital, quote unquote, filling it up. And that is like our last defense for the virus. That's our last defense for these communities. And I just think that, with all of the focus shifting to hospitalization, that's at least better. It's a better approach than what we've had to date.
Well, first off, I want to congratulate you on having only posted on Facebook twice this year. Had I done that, I'd save myself a lot of grief, and I'm really considering adopting such a policy. We talked about this a lot this morning, too, because I was looking at the governor's report, and it said that statewide 0.02% of the population is in hospitals. That means 2 people in every 10,000. And yet our hospital beds, I believe the figure are 73% full. We have a real problem if 0.2% of the population can fill up 3/4 of the hospital beds in the state. That would be a fascinating topic for a podcast all of its own. What happened to healthcare in America that we're now at a time when essentially we're hoping nobody gets sick because we really don't have any place to treat them if they do.
Well, and this is that interesting, and I believe it was, I want to say it was the Journal, one of the podcasts by the Wall Street Journal that I listened to. They had actually talked about how a couple hospitals, or collectively in New York City, had more hospital beds during the 1918, 1920 flu outbreak than they did for this pandemic. There were more hospital beds in New York City 100 years ago than there are today.
So go back and look at what's happened, closures and mergers and corporatization, and we see it in a lot of segments of the economy. Now, I don't know. I take a little bit of exception with what you said. I don't know that hospital rates are a better indicator of whether we should or should not be shut down. And the reason I think it matters, why, is so that we can make apples-to-apples comparisons. That's the only thing. If the people going into the hospital today, in other words, if everybody who gets the sniffles runs to the hospital and says, check me in, we need to know that compared to whether that was the case when hospitalization rates were X so many months ago. One of the things the governor said the other day, I believe it was that the average stay is now 5 days, down from 11.
Right.
So therefore, there's less pressure on the system if people are staying not as long. So the same number of people in the hospital today aren't going to put the burden on that it did 7 months ago if they're only staying half as long. So I think that's why some of those things matter, and that's what bugs me a little bit about this constantly shifting approach, is that we just got used to counting percentages of tests, and now we're doing hospitalization rates.
Right, and I should say I have serious reservation with the idea that the percentage, so that 0.02% number, and in his last two press conferences, Governor Cuomo has called that a very important number. He has called that the most important number. I'm not really sure why he says that, or
exactly.
Why he thinks that.
Why 9 months in, why did this become the most important number this week when it wasn't a number we even paid any attention to for all this other time?
Well, and I think from my point of view, when I say I think hospitalization rate is a better metric to use to determine the community situation, so to speak, is not from a pure, hospitalization rate among positive patients or positive COVIDs is, 3% or 4% or whatever the case may be. I mean, literally to capacity. So if you are at, say, 60% capacity in any given community, maybe folks should start thinking about that, and maybe you should start to figure out a way to try to prevent some additional spread. Or if you're getting to 80, 90% full, because that is when you're talking about, because these numbers he's basing on, according to the last press conference at least, are around surge and flex capacity numbers too. So we're not talking about basic capacity. We're talking about 100 pre-COVID 100% plus 25%.
Right.
So, you're talking about more beds. And if you are getting into that zone, to me, I just think it makes more logical sense to say that if your hospital capacity in the region has reached 90%, it's probably time to do something to prevent people to prevent the community from getting to 100%.
Sure. I mean, that makes sense. And from that standpoint, I understand it. The other thing we talked about a lot this morning on the Finger Lakes Morning News is, why did this happen? All summer long, statewide, we were at less than 1% positivity. We've been in the 4s for roughly maybe 3 to 4 weeks, and yesterday it was 5.7%. And here in the Finger Lakes, which again includes Monroe County and the state's counting, we're at 7%. What happened? That's a question to me that seems so fundamental, and I don't even see it being asked. Is it? I mean, what were we doing differently back in July when nobody? I mean, relatively speaking, hardly anybody had it, and we thought we were going to maybe wipe it out. To now, we have this resurgence back to almost March, April levels.
Well, it's got to be. And I mean, in a lot of metrics, we're past that point, right? We're now in worse shape than we were in the spring.
I mean, did people stop wearing masks? Is it all these little secret backyard parties?
Oh, it's the small get-togethers, absolutely. I mean, I can think of
But nobody was doing that in the summer?
Well, they were doing it outside. And that's the difference. I mean, viruses like this just frankly don't move as well in the summer. The interesting thing that I've held off on saying on the podcast before is I know a lot of people who are well-intentioned, thoughtful people who in 98% of their life are following the rules to an absolute T. And then in 2% of circumstances are doing things that they shouldn't be doing. To the letter of the guidance, frankly.
I think you're being real generous in saying it's 98-2. I think it might be more like 70-30.
Okay.
I've observed the same thing, and that's what makes it hard sometimes to get my head around all this, is that, I mean, and I did it. I went to a wedding this summer with people that we knew a couple of, but mostly didn't, and there were 40 people outdoors at picnic tables, all mask-free, in relatively close contact for a long time. Yeah. And I don't know why we did it. I guess it was summer and it was 0.9%, and we thought there was nothing to worry about. I see, I mean, in my own company, there's been inconsistency in terms of who's wearing masks and who isn't and when. And so I know there's definitely a very wrong-headed feeling among a lot of people that I won't get it from people I know. If a couple of my friends come over, that's okay. If a couple of strangers walked in on the street, I'd recoil in horror. And of course, there is no difference.
Yeah, and I think this is part of, and if we're taking the governor at his word, we're going to see in upstate New York a reduction in the total allowed bodies inside of a restaurant, for example, to be pulled to 25%. I think he's trying
very hard not to make it zero.
Right,
but I think there's no doubt we're going to be rolled back into what we referred to as phases back in March. That's coming, like you said. I think within a week that's coming.
So to that end, is it though? Because if that is, because here's what I think may end up happening, and this is, I'm not sure why I feel this way, but it's just consuming all of this information on a daily basis and hearing the mixed messaging that even comes from the governor about what needs to be done and data and public safety and yada, yada, yada. I think what we're going to see is a lot of shuffling at the surface. So changing of what orange means. Red means something different. We've already seen it with schools. Schools can stay open under any circumstances they so choose now. They can also close under any circumstances they so choose. We're going to see things shuffled in such a way where it appears as though things have gotten more intense or that restrictions have gotten more intense, but they don't actually get more intense. Example, I think with what the governor has said, even this, you mentioned Jennifer Lukey's reporting, that video, I think I saw it on Twitter, but I saw a video somewhere where she took the question she asked before Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And the question when he was addressing that same topic recently, I think maybe late last week or early this week, where he says gyms and salons aren't the problem. They have enough safety measures in place. We don't need to clamp down on them. So we may actually see a scenario where restrictions are actually lessened in some ways, but the appearance will be that we are going more in depth.
And I think at the end of the day, that's my fundamental problem with all of this since day one. We've had viruses before. We've had outbreaks before. How do you stop an outbreak of a virus? You find out who's got it. You get them away from people who don't. We really haven't done that very much during these 9 months. What we've done more of is treat everyone as if they have it and put us through these constantly shifting metrics and colors. We had the case of the Jewish Community Center that was on the Brighton-Henrietta line that was allowed to use, I think, the Brighton side of the building only if you entered through the Brighton doors.
The Henrietta side.
The Henrietta side. I knew it was one or the other. And only if you went through that door, as if that made a difference. And then the state, realizing how idiotic that all sounded, stepped in the next day and said, no, you're just closed.
Yeah, it's interesting, and unfortunately, we're not going to have time to get to a few of the other topics that we wanted to get to, but we'll get to them next week. The last thing I want to touch on today related to the pandemic in general is vaccine. We are now days away from distribution, or the first round of distribution. 170,000 doses are going to be distributed to nursing homes, staff, and residents. Good thing, because it's moving around in nursing homes like wildfire right now, even locally. Yeah. And we've seen these outbreaks like the one in Newark play out sort of slowly, but really impact a lot of people. And the data seems to be pointing toward a vaccine that is really effective, where the antibody load of those who are getting the vaccine is several hundred times greater than those who even had the virus, which clearly good news in the grand scheme of things. But, and I kind of guess I assumed this was coming given the anti-vax discussion around this. An assembly member from downstate introduced a bill on the 4th of December, I believe, to mandate the COVID-19 vaccine if we cannot reach, or if the state cannot willfully reach, herd immunity. On the surface, I don't want to get into the nuts and bolts of this, and who knows if this even has legs to get all the way to the governor's desk, because even the governor himself has said repeatedly, you can't force people to vaccinate, even though the state has forced people to vaccinate for years. Surface level, what are your thoughts on this?
You're familiar with the satirical publication, The Onion?
Of course.
I'm surprised that they can even stay in business. The difference between what they do and the actual news has become so thin that I'm surprised they're still in business. So nothing surprises me anymore. Nothing does. Should we be frightened as hell that someone wants the government to have the ability to stick a needle in our arms? Yeah. I don't know if it'll ever happen. I'm hopeful that we will. There was a story today, and I don't remember if it was upstate. One of the Rochester medical facilities is preparing to receive a pretty good sized dose of the vaccine. So some people in Monroe County may be getting it in the next few days.
I'm
hopeful that this will work, and put this behind us. I've been saying for a while, and I'm kind of solidifying in my thinking, I think it would not be unrealistic to expect that by Labor Day 2021, we're back to relatively normal living.
Interesting stuff. That would be well timed, and it's interesting. It even seems to be the messaging from the health officials on the federal and state level too. Don't expect things to change in quarter one or quarter two.
Because a lot of people in America aren't even going to be able to get this vaccine until March or April,
right?
And they're going to start with, and rightfully so, with the high risk population. So for Joe Average on the street, you're not going to get vaccinated in December or January or even February. So that's just, I'd been saying that for a while based on some of the sports cancellations and things, and the more I see the way this is playing out, I think that would be a reasonable. And it's also sort of a psychological point in the year for most of us, end of summer. It would represent getting back to school. So I think that would be a reasonable expectation if the rollout of the vaccine goes decently, is that maybe by next Labor Day, we put away our masks and we remember this as a bad nightmare.
Yeah, maybe. In the meantime, though, we will be back next week. Obviously, we're closing in on Christmas, and we will at some point here within the next few weeks be sort of looking back at the biggest stories of 2020, the biggest stories that weren't COVID.
I was going to say, we'll look back at the second biggest story.
Yeah, we'll look back at stories 2 through 6 and not number 1. Where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday? I'm
on the Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. In Geneva, that's 106.3 FM now and 1240 WGVA. In Auburn, it's 98.1 FM and 1590 AM WAUB.
The Weekend Debrief is a production of FL1 Digital Media. Check the show out on Spotify or wherever you get podcasts. Have a question for us? Email it to debrief@fingerlakes1.com. You can also check out our daily debrief, which is a shortened version of this podcast, where we dive into local issues and headlines with the people behind them. Check that out by visiting fingerlakes1.com/daily. You can also find those episodes in this very feed on Spotify, Anchor, or Apple Podcasts, wherever you are listening from. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.